In a dry cave above the Dead Sea, fragments of the Book of Enoch survived for more than 2,000 years, written in Aramaic on darkened leather. Their existence creates a tension the modern reader cannot avoid. This was not merely a medieval legend. Parts of Enoch were being copied in the Second Temple period. Yet the idea behind this title is stranger than the fragments themselves. The Book of Enoch does not say that a newborn literally forgets heaven, loses a supernatural sense, or has its memory erased. No surviving Enochic manuscript makes that claim. What the text does present is a world in which human beings enter life after the original order has already been damaged. The Watchers descend. Forbidden knowledge spreads. Violence multiplies. The earth itself is portrayed as corrupted before later generations can understand what normal was supposed to be. That distinction matters. If Enoch is read on its own terms, what humans lose at birth is not a remembered paradise, but access to an undistorted world. They inherit consequences before they can recognize their source. Some scholars interpret Enoch's cosmic drama as an explanation for why evil can feel older than individual choice, embedded in the condition into which people are born. But three questions remain. What exactly did the Watchers change? Why does Enoch treat knowledge itself as dangerous in certain forms? And if humanity enters a broken order without ever seeing the original one, how would anyone know what had been lost? The answer begins with the way Enoch survives. The work we call First Enoch is not a single book written at one moment, but a collection of writings composed over time. Its major sections include the Book of the Watchers, the Parables, the Astronomical Book, the Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch. For this investigation, the most important material begins in 1 Enoch 6 through 16, where the Watchers descend, take human wives, teach forbidden arts, and produce a crisis that reaches beyond individual wrongdoing. For centuries, the complete text was preserved principally in Ge'ez within the Ethiopian Christian tradition, but the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls changed the historical picture. Aramaic fragments of several Enochic compositions were found at Qumran, especially in Cave 4, showing that Enochic literature circulated among Jews centuries before the surviving medieval Ethiopian manuscripts. Among the cataloged fragments are 4 Q201, 4 Q202, and 4 Q204, all preserving portions of 1st Enoch in Aramaic. That physical evidence matters because it separates two questions that are often confused. One is whether ancient Jews actually read and copied Enochic traditions. The fragments show that they did. The other is whether every theological idea later associated with Enoch was present in those early copies. The manuscripts cannot prove that. And the text itself makes an equally important distinction. Human beings are not described as arriving with conscious memories of a perfect world. Instead, they are born inside a history already altered by rebellion, violence, illicit instruction, and judgment. Enoch's argument is therefore about inherited conditions, not erased personal memory. And that is where the manuscript story becomes more than background. But if corruption is inherited as a condition, where does the text locate the first break in the chain? The first break appears in the Book of the Watchers. In 1 Enoch 6, a group of heavenly beings sees human women and agrees to descend together. Their leader is named Semyaza in many translations, and the group binds itself by an oath on Mount Hermon. The text states that they take wives, father children, and cross a boundary between heavenly and human realms. Then the account becomes more specific. In 1 Enoch 7 and 8, the giants consume what humans produce, then turn against people and animals as violence expands. At the same time, individual watchers teach skills and bodies of knowledge. Azazel is associated with weapons, metalworking, ornaments, and cosmetics. Other figures are linked with sorcery, root cutting, astrology, and signs of the earth and heavens. The text presents these teachings not as neutral discoveries arriving at the right time, but as knowledge introduced through rebellion. That is the crucial point. The problem is not knowledge in the abstract. Enoch itself contains elaborate knowledge about calendars, heavenly movements, judgment, and cosmic order. The danger lies in knowledge detached from proper boundaries and given in a way that accelerates domination, seduction, violence, and disorder. Some scholars, therefore, interpret the Watcher's story as an ancient explanation for how destructive technologies and practices could enter human society without originating in ordinary human development alone. But this remains a literary and theological claim, not archaeological proof that supernatural beings taught metallurgy or astrology. Its implication, however, is sharper than it first appears. Humans born after these events do not choose the conditions that surround them. They arrive in a world where violence, distorted desire, and dangerous knowledge already exist. They inherit a landscape shaped by decisions made before they were alive. In that sense, the loss begins before birth, not because each person remembers a perfect world and forgets it, but because no generation after the rupture encounters innocence as the normal condition anymore. And yet Enoch adds one detail that makes this darker. The corruption does not end when the giants die. The continuation appears in 1 Enoch 15 and 16 after judgment is pronounced against the Watchers and their giant offspring. The text states that the bodies of the giants will be destroyed, but that something of them will remain. Their spirits, born from the union of heavenly beings and human women, are described as evil spirits upon the earth. That is a different kind of inheritance. The giants are no longer simply remembered as violent beings from an earlier age. Their aftermath becomes invisible. According to the text, these spirits afflict, oppress, attack, and trouble human beings. They are presented as continuing agents of disorder after the physical generation that produced them has disappeared. For the logic of Enoch, this deepens the problem introduced by the Watchers. Corruption is no longer confined to weapons, illicit arts, or bloodshed that can be seen. It becomes part of the unseen environment in which later humanity lives. The text is offering an ancient explanation for why destructive forces seem to persist even after their apparent causes are gone. Some scholars connect this passage with the development of Jewish ideas about hostile spirits in the Second Temple period. The evidence shows that such concepts appear in Enochic literature, but it does not establish that every later Jewish or Christian teaching about demons comes directly from this passage. The relationship between traditions is more complicated. Still, the narrative consequence is striking. A child born generations after the Watchers' rebellion would enter a world shaped by effects it did not create and could not directly observe. Violence has a history. Knowledge has a history. Even spiritual danger, within the text's own worldview, has a history. This is why the title's question cannot be answered by saying that humans simply forget heaven. Enoch's darker claim is that they inherit a damaged reality so early and so completely that the damage can appear ordinary. But if the corruption becomes invisible, one small feature in the surviving textual tradition raises an even harder question. Does Enoch describe humanity as merely trapped in that condition, or as gradually learning to participate in it? One overlooked detail sits inside the list of teachings in 1 Enoch 8. Modern translations do not always render the same terms in exactly the same way, because the underlying textual tradition survives across Aramaic fragments, Greek witnesses, and the complete Ge'ez version. That matters especially when the text describes what certain Watchers taught humans to observe in the heavens. Some translations use terms such as astrology, constellations, or signs of the stars. Others reflect slightly different reconstructions or broader expressions for celestial phenomena. The surviving evidence is therefore clear about the general theme, but less precise than a modern reader may assume about the exact technical system being described. Damaged fragments also mean that no single early manuscript preserves every line needed to settle every wording dispute. That small uncertainty changes the interpretation. If the passage is read as condemning all observation of the sky, it clashes with another major Enochic work, the Astronomical Book, which carefully describes heavenly cycles and calendrical order. But if the condemned teaching concerns illicit divination, manipulation, or knowledge transmitted outside proper heavenly boundaries, the tension becomes more coherent. Some scholars interpret the contrast in precisely this direction. Enoch does not reject knowledge of the heavens as such. It distinguishes ordered revelation from forbidden disclosure. The manuscript evidence supports the existence of that contrast, but it does not allow us to reconstruct every lost technical term with certainty. The larger implication is uncomfortable. The danger in Enoch may not be ignorance versus knowledge. It may be the inability to tell legitimate knowledge from knowledge that has been detached from its proper place. A person can inherit both without being told where the boundary originally stood. And if humans are born into a world where both appear side by side, how would they know which inheritance is trustworthy? The modern evidence enters through a very different doorway: manuscript imaging and paleography. The Aramaic Enoch fragments from Qumran are not intact books. Many survive as small, darkened pieces of leather, their edges broken, their ink faded, and their lines incomplete. Scholars reconstruct them by comparing handwriting, surviving words, parallel passages, and the spacing that remains between letters. This changes how confidently we can read certain details. A fragment does not become more complete because modern technology photographs it more clearly. Multispectral imaging can reveal ink that is difficult to see under ordinary light, and digital photography can help researchers distinguish traces, joins, and letter shapes. But imaging cannot recover words that are physically missing. Paleography can estimate when a manuscript was copied by comparing its script with other dated or datable hands. Yet those estimates are still ranges, not timestamps. That distinction is important for Enoch. The Qumran fragments physically demonstrate that Enochic compositions circulated in Jewish communities during the Second Temple period. Their Aramaic language also brings us closer to forms of the text that predate the complete Ge'ez manuscripts by many centuries. But the fragments do not preserve every sentence later found in Ethiopic, and they do not prove that every later reading existed in exactly the same form at Qumran. This is where modern textual criticism becomes useful. By comparing Aramaic fragments with Greek remains and the Ge'ez tradition, scholars can identify agreements, differences, and places where transmission may have changed wording. That does not prove the theology of the watchers. It does something more limited and more concrete. It shows that the text itself has a recoverable history. And that history mirrors the problem inside the story. Later readers inherit a damaged textual world, just as Enoch describes humans inheriting a damaged moral one. The parallel is only explanatory, not evidence of design. The manuscript fragments, therefore, let us observe transmission without pretending that transmission was perfectly uniform. But one historical fact complicates everything. Some communities carefully preserved Enoch, while others eventually did not do so. That divergence did not happen all at once, and it cannot be reduced to a single council or act of suppression. Enoch's reception moved through different communities, languages, and arguments over authority. The evidence begins with ancient Judaism. Fragments from Qumran show that Enochic writings were copied and preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yet preservation is not the same as universal canonization. Jewish communities in the Second Temple period did not all use identical collections of authoritative books, and the surviving evidence does not show that First Enoch held the same status everywhere. Early Christianity presents a different complication. The letter of Jude, verses 14 and 15, contains language closely corresponding to 1 Enoch 1:9 and explicitly attributes a prophecy to Enoch. That demonstrates that an Enochic tradition could be cited positively within an early Christian text. But citation does not by itself prove that every Christian community regarded the entire book as scripture. Later writers disagreed. Tertullian defended Enoch and argued for its value, while other Christian traditions did not preserve it within their biblical collections. Over time, the complete work disappeared from most Greek and Latin manuscript transmission. That historical loss is real. What the evidence does not support is the popular claim that the Council of Nicaea removed the Book of Enoch from the Bible. No surviving record of that council establishes such an action. One tradition, however, preserved what others did not. In Ethiopian Christianity, First Enoch survived in Ge'ez and remained part of the broader scriptural tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. Centuries later, European scholars encountered complete Ethiopic manuscripts, making possible modern study of a work that elsewhere had survived only in fragments, quotations, and partial translations. So the conflict is not simply belief against unbelief. It is a history of different communities drawing different boundaries around inherited texts. And that raises a more precise mystery. If Enoch could be copied at Qumran, echoed in Jude, defended by some Christians, and preserved in Ethiopia. Why did its authority become so uneven across the traditions that inherited the same ancient world? That uneven authority leaves a modern problem that no surviving manuscript can fully settle. We possess ancient evidence for Enochic literature, but not one complete Second Temple copy of the work in the form modern readers know. The Aramaic manuscripts from Qumran preserve substantial portions of several Enochic compositions, yet they are fragmentary. Some passages survive in multiple pieces, others are missing entirely. The complete text of First Enoch comes through the later Ge'ez tradition. While Greek witnesses preserve additional sections and wording, textual critics compare these streams. But comparison is not the same as recovering a perfect original. This matters because every claim about what ancient readers had must be limited by what actually survives. A passage preserved only in Ge'ez may be ancient, but the absence of an Aramaic fragment containing it does not prove either that it was present at Qumran or that it was added later. Silence in a damaged manuscript tradition cannot answer that question by itself. Scholars can sometimes reconstruct missing letters or words from parallel versions, line length, grammar, and context. Those reconstructions can be persuasive. They are still reconstructions. A broken edge of leather remains a broken edge of leather. That creates the final major uncertainty in this investigation. Enoch presents humanity as living inside consequences inherited from an earlier rupture. But our own access to that claim is also inherited through incomplete transmission. We can identify ancient layers, compare languages, and trace reception. Yet some of the earliest textual links remain physically absent. The mystery is therefore not simply what Enoch means. It is how much of the earliest form of that meaning can still be recovered, and whether the missing evidence would sharpen the distinction between inherited corruption and human responsibility. Now, an important distinction is necessary. The physical evidence proves that Enochic writings existed in antiquity, circulated in Aramaic, and were copied among the manuscripts found near Qumran. The textual evidence shows that these writings describe a rebellion of heavenly beings, forbidden instruction, violence, judgment, and a continuing corruption that outlives its first visible causes. Neither category proves that the Watchers were historical beings, that demons can be scientifically identified, or that every event in the narrative occurred exactly as described. Interpretation begins only after those limits are clear. Some scholars read the Watchers' tradition as an ancient explanation for the origin of evil, especially forms of evil that seem larger than individual human choices. Others emphasize its concern with illicit knowledge, disrupted boundaries, or the violence associated with powerful technologies and social practices. These readings overlap, but they are not identical. The surviving evidence does not force one single interpretation, and speculation begins where evidence becomes thinner still. The text does not state that every human soul consciously existed before birth. It does not say newborns undergo a literal erasure of heavenly memory. It does not describe a biological mechanism by which corruption passes from one generation to another. Yet the central pattern remains. If the Watcher's story is correctly understood as describing a world altered before later humans enter it, and if its forbidden teachings represent forms of knowledge separated from proper cosmic order, then the larger question becomes whether Enoch is describing a condition more subtle than simple forgetting. Perhaps what humans lose is not a memory at all. Perhaps, within the logic of the text, they lose the possibility of encountering an unbroken world firsthand. Every generation begins after the damage. Every child learns reality from people who were themselves born inside it. Violence can look natural because violence is already present. Distorted knowledge can look normal because the original boundary is no longer visible. That remains a theological and literary implication, not a scientific conclusion. But if Enoch's deepest warning concerns inherited normality rather than erased memory, then the final mystery is no longer what humans once knew. It is whether anyone born inside the broken order could recognize the difference between the world as it is and the world the text imagines existed before it, back above the Dead Sea. The fragments remain what they were when they were first recovered, pieces of ancient leather, darkened by time, carrying broken lines of Aramaic ink. They do not contain a secret sentence saying that newborn children forget heaven. They do not prove that the Watchers walk the earth. What they preserve is something more restrained, and perhaps more unsettling. They preserve evidence that ancient Jewish readers copied a tradition in which humanity entered a world already altered by rebellion, violence, forbidden instruction, and consequences that continued beyond their first cause. The physical fragments still exist. Their damaged edges remind us that part of the story is missing, while the surviving words prevent us from dismissing the tradition as a recent invention. Across centuries, languages, and communities, that idea endured. People can inherit a condition before they understand its origin. In Enoch's world, the deepest loss is therefore not a memory erased at birth. It is the absence of any personal experience of the world before the rupture. The cave gives us no final answer, only evidence that the question is ancient. If every generation begins inside a reality already shaped by what came before, how could anyone recognize what humanity had lost before they were born?